On September 1, 1939, German forces surged into Poland, aiming for a rapid and decisive conquest. Yet barely 2 decades earlier, their predecessors had marched in the opposite direction, retreating as a defeated army. In November 1918, after 4 grueling years of World War I, Germany's emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was forced to abdicate. German troops were exhausted, crushed by relentless offensives from British, French, and American forces, while the civilian population struggled with widespread starvation. Amid the chaos, a powerful myth began to take shape. German generals and soldiers claimed they had not truly lost on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by cowardly politicians at home. Still, at 11 o'clock a.m. on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I officially ended. The following month, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe with a bold vision: a new world order. He convinced world leaders to establish the League of Nations, a forum where international disputes would be resolved through diplomacy rather than warfare. Across Europe, old empires were dismantled. Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, collapsed, giving rise to new nations: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself shrank considerably. But this reshaping of Europe carried hidden dangers. Many of the new countries included large German-speaking populations, laying the groundwork for future tensions. The desire to reunite these communities would one day reignite conflict. Germany's hardships did not end there. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations, £6.6 billion to France and Britain, amounts the nation could scarcely afford. Meanwhile, Wilson's vision of global peace faltered when the U.S. Congress refused to join the League, retreating into isolationism. Germany had transformed. Its monarchy was gone, replaced by the Weimar Republic, a fledgling democracy. But this new government faced relentless challenges. Street clashes broke out between radical right-wing nationalists and left-wing communists. Then, in 1923, hyperinflation devastated the economy, wiping out ordinary citizens' savings and leaving the nation vulnerable. This volatile climate proved fertile ground for radical politicians, none more infamous than Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria, Hitler had fought in World War I with distinction, earning the Iron Cross. After the war, he moved to Munich, where his fiery speeches allowed him to rise quickly through the ranks of the small National Socialist, or Nazi, party. In October 1923, he attempted an armed coup against the Weimar government, which failed, landing him in prison for 9 months. There, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his vision for Germany, blaming the nation's struggles on Jews and calling for the country to rebuild its strength and expand eastward. After his release, Hitler focused on transforming the Nazi Party into a disciplined political machine. He vowed to seize power through democratic means rather than force. For a time, Germany stabilized. The economy recovered and support for extremist parties waned, but the global stage shifted dramatically. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market collapsed. Billions of dollars vanished, and a worldwide economic depression swept across Europe. Hitler's chance had arrived. By the early 1930s, Germany was in crisis. Unemployment had skyrocketed to over 6 million, and only the extremists seemed to offer solutions. Among them, Adolf Hitler stood out. By 1931, his Nazi party had transformed into a mass movement, backed by the brown-shirted SA storm troops, who numbered nearly 3 million. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis emerged as the largest party in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. Yet Hitler refused to form a coalition, leaving the government deadlocked. Desperate to break the impasse, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor in January 1933. The turning point came quickly. Within weeks, the Reichstag building was set ablaze. Hitler blamed the communists and demanded emergency powers, which he then used to outlaw all other political parties. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler seized the opportunity to declare himself Führer, absolute leader of Germany. Initially, Hitler's actions seemed focused on rebuilding Germany rather than pursuing conquest. Over the next 3 years, he poured millions into public works projects, including the 5,000-mile Autobahn network, providing jobs for the unemployed. Behind the scenes, however, he was secretly funding an enormous rearmament program. The Treaty of Versailles had limited the German army to 100,000 men and forbidden tanks, submarines, and an air force. Hitler tripled the army's size and in 1935 revealed the Luftwaffe, a brand new air force with 2,500 planes. Surpassing both Britain and France, unemployment fell and the Nazis' popularity soared. With domestic strength secured, Hitler made his first territorial moves. In 1935, the Saarland district returned to German control after a League of Nations plebiscite. A year later, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region that Versailles had declared off-limits for military forces. Many at the time viewed these moves as merely reclaiming German lands, and neither Britain nor France intervened. By the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, the Nazis appeared to many as a government, restoring national pride without threatening others. Yet there were early warnings of darker ambitions. The 1935 Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and banned marriages between true Aryans and Jews, exposing the regime's racial ideology. Meanwhile, the first threats to global peace did not originate in Europe. They came from the Far East. Japan, already a military power at the start of the 20th century, had defeated Russia in 1905 and joined the Allies in World War I. After the war, it was recognized as a world power and joined the League of Nations. Yet Japan's political system was contradictory. While officially a democracy, feudal traditions remained strong. The emperor was revered as a living god, and to most Japanese, he was the nation's true leader. Japan faced serious challenges in the early 20th century. Its population was growing rapidly, but the country lacked the natural resources to fuel its expanding industries. Leaders looked abroad for solutions, setting their sights on China's Manchuria, a region rich in grain, coal, and minerals, and already home to Japanese troops. Other targets included European colonies in Asia, Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong under British control, French Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies. Yet Japan had to act cautiously, provoking another major power in the Pacific, namely the United States, was risky. Despite its anti-imperialist rhetoric, the U.S. maintained a de facto empire in the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and several islands were under American control. Although it had the power to challenge Japan, America's focus after World War I had been elsewhere. The 1920s marked the nation's Jazz Age, a period of economic boom, stock market speculation, and pursuit of pleasure. With its army downsized and naval forces limited by international treaties, the U.S. effectively allowed Japan a free hand in the Pacific. The Great Depression changed everything. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, and tens of thousands became homeless, living in makeshift shantytowns. Economic pain replaced previous distractions, creating a window for Japanese expansion. In 1931, without consulting their own government, Japanese troops in Manchuria seized the regional capital, Mukden, and quickly occupied the entire territory. They established a puppet state, Manchukuo, installing Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, deposed in 1911, as its nominal ruler. The League of Nations faced its first serious test. Japan was condemned internationally, yet it refused to accept the League's report and simply withdrew from the organization. The League was powerless, and Japan, now a global pariah, paid no heed. Its leaders turned their attention to further conquests in China, a nation already in turmoil. China was riven by civil war. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's government fought the communist forces led by Mao Zedong, leaving the country divided and vulnerable. In 1936, Japan signed a pact with Hitler, ensuring protection against a possible Soviet intervention in China. Then, in July 1937, Japanese forces provoked an incident with Chinese troops, using it as a pretext to invade. Initially caught off guard, the Chinese fought back fiercely, even forming a temporary alliance between communists and the Kuomintang. Japan responded with amphibious assaults, and by the end of 1937, it controlled much of northern China and the coastline. The Japanese campaign was marked by extreme brutality. Cities were bombed indiscriminately, and Western civilians were evacuated from Shanghai, which endured a 3-month siege. After capturing Nanjing on December 17, 1937, Japanese forces unleashed a horrific 6-week massacre, killing an estimated 300,000 civilians and committing widespread acts of rape and destruction. The Japanese campaign in China grew even bolder. They attacked British and American warships sent to protect trade routes, with the worst incident occurring on December 12, 1937. Japanese bombers sank the American gunboat Panay, killing 50 crew members. Yet despite these provocations, the Western powers held back, and the League of Nations remained powerless. In the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt considered a naval blockade of Japan, warning that foreign aggression could have serious consequences for America. Britain, however, feared such a move might spark war. In the end, Roosevelt's only concrete support was a $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek's government to purchase arms. Even though Chinese communists and the Kuomintang were now fighting together, the Soviet Union offered little help beyond a few border clashes with Japanese forces in Manchuria. China was left to face the Japanese on its own. By 1938, Japan had captured Canton and pushed Chinese forces further west. All the lofty promises of the League of Nations to stop international aggression had proven meaningless. Meanwhile, the Western powers were beginning to face threats much closer to home. Across Europe, another authoritarian leader was rising, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. Today, his posturing may seem almost comical, but in 1922, Italy was teetering on the edge of chaos. Strikes, land seizures, and unrest paralyzed the country. Its democratic government appeared as helpless as Germany's Weimar Republic had. Mussolini, a war veteran and journalist, decided to act. He founded the right-wing Fascist Party, and with a general strike bringing Italy to a standstill in August 1922, ordered his followers to march on Rome. Fearing civil war, King Victor Emmanuel invited Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini quickly eliminated political opposition and assumed full dictatorial powers. His government was appointed rather than elected, with all authority concentrated in the fascist Grand Council. Like Hitler, Mussolini's early actions won him widespread popularity. Massive public works programs provided jobs and modernized Italy's infrastructure. Corruption was curtailed, and the mafia largely neutralized. The armed forces were strengthened, including a modern air force, while the Mediterranean fleet surpassed the combined power of Britain and France in the region. When the Great Depression struck, Italy weathered it better than most nations. Mussolini's regime became a model admired internationally, with leaders like Hitler viewing fascism as decisive and strong compared to the perceived weakness of European democracies. Yet Mussolini sought more than admiration. He dreamed of reviving the Roman Empire. His first target for imperial expansion was Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. Italy already held colonies nearby in Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, giving him a foothold for conquest. In December 1934, Italian forces provoked a clash with Abyssinian troops at an oasis deep in the Ogaden region of Abyssinia. Mussolini responded by sending reinforcements from Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, demanding reparations from the small African nation. Emperor Haile Selassie personally appealed to the League of Nations, calling on it to uphold its principles. Here was a clear test. A small member state threatened by another League member, but the League failed to act. Britain's foreign minister, Anthony Eden, attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution, but Mussolini refused. In early October 1935, Italian forces invaded from both Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Abyssinia's poorly equipped army was no match for modern artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The Italian Air Force dominated the skies, even using gas bombs, despite chemical warfare being banned under the Treaty of Versailles. Within 6 months, Abyssinia was fully occupied. Haile Selassie fled into exile in Britain. From its Swiss headquarters, the League of Nations could only protest. Economic sanctions were imposed, but they had little real impact. Mussolini's conquest exposed two critical truths. The League of Nations was powerless, and Europe's leading democracies. Britain and France were unwilling to confront aggressors. Both nations had been scarred by World War I and never fully recovered economically. Waves of strikes, social unrest, and high unemployment had weakened them even before the Great Depression. Their empires, enlarged by former German colonies and Middle Eastern territories once held by the Ottoman Empire, imposed additional financial and military burdens. Most of all, both nations were haunted by the horrific human losses of the Great War. A succession of British leaders, Lloyd George, Ramsay MacDonald, and especially Stanley Baldwin, were determined to avoid future conflicts. Although Britain had ended World War I with a large and effective conscript army, it was quickly reduced to a small professional force meant primarily to police its empire. When the Great Depression struck, any plans for modernization were abandoned. By the time Europe edged toward another war, Britain was both economically and militarily weakened. France had suffered even more devastating losses than Britain during World War I. Ever wary of Germany, France maintained a large conscript army, but a declining birth rate in the 1920s meant it faced a looming manpower shortage by the mid-1930s. Recognizing it could never outnumber Germany militarily, France adopted a defensive strategy, preparing to hold its ground rather than take the offensive. In 1930, France began construction of the Maginot Line, a chain of massive fortifications along its border with Germany, extending to the Belgian frontier, where it was supposed to connect with Belgian defenses. This strategy committed France to a purely defensive posture. The country lacked the capacity to launch attacks on Italy, even if Britain had been able to provide troops, and both nations recognized that Mussolini's growing Mediterranean fleet outnumbered their navies. So when Italy invaded Abyssinia, Britain and France chose inaction. The conflict felt distant, someone else's problem. Meanwhile, both countries were still grappling with the economic and social devastation of the Great Depression, and looming over all of Europe was a more immediate and dangerous threat. A rearming Germany. The growing power of Germany and Italy would soon become evident in Spain. In 1936, Spain erupted into a brutal civil war, pitting families against one another, communists against fascists, believers against atheists. After the monarchy was abolished in 1931, a left-wing government established a republic. By February 1936, leftist parties united under the Popular Front and narrowly won national elections. Although their reforms were moderate, strikes and land seizures sparked fears of a communist takeover among conservative forces. Within the Spanish army, traditionally conservative and Catholic, senior officers began plotting a coup. One of them was General Francisco Franco, former chief of staff, exiled to the Canary Islands. On July 17, 1936, units stationed in Morocco mutinied, and the next day Franco flew to join them, forming a nationalist movement aimed at saving Spain from communism. Mainland garrisons quickly joined the rebellion, while the Popular Front called for volunteers to defend the Republic. Initially, Franco faced a major obstacle. His forces were trapped in North Africa and needed transport across the Strait of Gibraltar. He turned to Adolf Hitler for help. Within a month, Luftwaffe transport aircraft began airlifting Franco's seasoned troops into southern Spain. At first, the Republic seemed to hold the advantage. Pro-Franco uprisings in Madrid and Barcelona were crushed, leaving Republican forces in control of most of eastern Spain. Franco's nationalists were confined mainly to the northwest and parts of the south, but the balance shifted dramatically when Hitler and Mussolini began providing substantial support. Hitler saw Spain as a testing ground for his growing military capabilities, sending the first Panzer tanks, roughly 12,000 German troops, and the Condor Legion, equipped with modern bombers and fighter aircraft. Mussolini reinforced Franco's forces with what he called a volunteer corps of 50,000 men and over 700 aircraft. The Republicans appealed for help from Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Britain and France, fearing a wider European war, declared a policy of non-intervention. Germany and Italy signed the agreement while continuing to support Franco behind the scenes. When their involvement could no longer be ignored, Joseph Stalin stepped in to aid the Republic. Concerned about the rise of fascism and hoping the Spanish conflict would occupy Germany and Italy, the Soviet Union sent roughly 700 advisors, along with tanks and aircraft. Still, Soviet support was minor compared to the combined German and Italian war machine. The Republic's most significant external help came from the international brigades, some 30,000 volunteers from the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere, who traveled to Spain to fight against fascism. With foreign support in place, the nationalists launched two major offensives, one pushing from the north toward Barcelona, the other, led by Franco, advancing toward Madrid. By late 1936, Madrid was surrounded on three sides and under constant siege. The conflict was brutal. Republicans executed Catholic priests suspected of aiding nationalists, while Franco's troops massacred suspected communists. German and Italian bombers targeted civilian areas indiscriminately. In April 1937, the Basque town of Guernica suffered the worst bombing, with approximately 6,000 civilians killed. Over time, Republican territory steadily shrank. Despite courageous resistance, undertrained and poorly equipped Republican forces could not match Franco's disciplined army. And the modern firepower of Germany and Italy, Madrid became a powerful symbol of resistance, but internal divisions weakened the Republican side. Communists and socialists insisted the war be fought first, with political reform later, while anarchists and syndicalists sought to transform the conflict into a workers' revolution. These ideological clashes erupted into violent confrontations in Barcelona in May 1937, further undermining the Republican cause. By the end of 1938, the nationalists had reduced Republican control to two isolated regions, one around Barcelona and another stretching from Madrid to the Mediterranean coast. Madrid held out, but the international brigades were withdrawn, and more nations began recognizing Franco's government as his forces prepared for the final assault. Exhausted after nearly 3 years of fighting, Madrid surrendered at the end of March 1939. A month later, Franco formally declared the conflict over. The scars of Spain's civil war would take decades to heal, and in some ways, they never fully did. Internationally, Franco's victory was disastrous. Hitler and Mussolini saw it as confirmation that Britain and France were too weak to resist determined aggressors. Stalin despaired at the democracy's unwillingness to confront fascism, while Hitler recognized that the path was clear to pursue the aggressive ambitions outlined in Mein Kampf. Even before the Spanish Civil War ended, Hitler had been acting on his long-term plans. On February 3, 1933, he told his top commanders that his ultimate goal was to conquer territory in the east and Germanize it ruthlessly. Preparations for massive expansion began immediately. Although Germany had been forbidden tanks, a secret 1923 treaty with the Soviet Union had allowed the development of armored vehicle designs and mobile warfare tactics. Energetic young officers, including Heinz Guderian, studied British military theorists such as Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel John Fuller, and even observed exercises at Salisbury Plain during the 1920s. From these studies, they devised the concept of fast-moving units combining tanks, artillery, and infantry for rapid, deep thrusts into enemy territory. Hitler embraced these ideas, and the new army was organized into 3 panzer divisions. The Luftwaffe, led by former World War I ace Hermann Göring, built on years of clandestine preparation. Civilian aircraft production and flying clubs had maintained pilot skills even when Germany was banned from having an air force. Hitler officially revealed the Luftwaffe in March 1935, announced the army would expand to 300,000 men, and reintroduced conscription. Britain and France protested feebly at this blatant breach of Versailles, but soon began rearming slowly and reluctantly. Until this point, Hitler's ambitions had been modest, reclaiming the Rhineland and the Saar, but he now set his sights on Austria. Austrian Nazis had already attempted a coup in 1934, seeking unification with Germany. Despite shared language and culture, Austria had never been part of a German state. In February 1938, another Nazi plot was uncovered. Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg protested to Hitler, who responded by demanding that Austria treat its Nazis fairly and hold a referendum on whether to remain independent. On March 12, 1938, the eve of the planned Austrian referendum, Hitler, fearing the vote might go against him, sent German troops into Austria. The invasion came as a complete surprise, but Nazi sympathizers in Austria welcomed the Germans enthusiastically. The operation was entirely bloodless. Within hours, Hitler declared Austria part of the Third Reich. For the first time, a sovereign nation had been absorbed into Greater Germany. Once again, the Western democracies failed to respond. By the summer of 1938, Hitler had set his sights on Czechoslovakia. In the northwest lay the Sudetenland, home to a large German minority. These Sudeten Germans had once belonged to the Austrian Empire, but had been cut off when Czechoslovakia was created in 1919, a time bomb planted by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler encouraged their demands for autonomy and threatened military action if the Czech government resisted. The Czechoslovak army, large, well-equipped, and supported by formidable border fortifications, prepared to resist. Hitler temporarily backed down. In early September, concerned that war might erupt, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler twice, seeking a peaceful resolution. Hitler assured him that if he were granted the Sudetenland, he would make no further territorial claims in Europe. On September 29, 1938, in Munich, Mussolini mediated an agreement. France and Britain consented to hand over the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's formal pledge of no further expansion. Chamberlain returned to Britain waiving the agreement, famously claiming it guaranteed peace in our time. On October 1, German troops occupied the Sudetenland and took control of its border fortifications. With the Sudetenland secured, Hitler turned his attention to Poland. Once again, he used the pretext of protecting a German minority. He demanded the return of the port of Danzig so East Prussia could connect with the rest of Germany. The Poles refused and Hitler hesitated. He was not yet ready for full-scale war and still had unfinished business in Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, Slovakia, ethnically distinct from the Czech lands, appealed to Hitler for greater autonomy. He summoned Czechoslovak Prime Minister Emil Hácha to Berlin, pressuring him to place the country under German protection. German troops then marched unopposed into the remainder of Czechoslovakia. Most of the country was annexed into the Reich, while Slovakia became a German protectorate. For the first time, Hitler had seized territory with no significant German population, and Britain and France offered only weak protests. At the end of March, Hitler renewed his demands for Danzig. This time, Britain and France issued a clear warning. They would declare war if Germany attacked Poland. But Hitler paid little heed. Confident in their weakness and indecision, he pressed forward. Meanwhile, Stalin grew increasingly concerned about Hitler's aggression. In April, he proposed an alliance with Britain and France, but negotiations made little progress. Frustrated, Stalin turned to a different solution. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union and Germany, long seen as ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. Secretly, the agreement divided Poland between them and gave Stalin free rein to occupy Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. With the Eastern Front secured, Hitler ordered his forces to prepare for an immediate invasion of Poland. On the evening of August 31, 1939, the German army stood ready to launch its assault. The Führer had made the decision that would ignite the Second World War.